Kentucky, 1989. A pathologist stands over a steel table with a horse's heart in his hands, and the heart is wrong. Not diseased, not damaged, wrong in a different way. It is nearly 3 times the size it should be, and Dr. Thomas Swerchek has performed enough of these examinations to know what a normal heart looks like, and this is not that. The horse died 16 years after he last raced. The autopsy was routine. What Swerchek found was not. Everyone who watched this horse run in 1973 already believed he was the greatest thoroughbred America had ever produced. Yet belief is not evidence, and for 16 years, nobody had anything more than a stopwatch and a memory to back that belief up. What was the actual, physical difference between this horse and every other horse that had ever run? Was he simply lucky? Or was something different, something measurable, built into him from the start? The story begins not on a racetrack, but in a foaling barn in Virginia, 3 years before anyone thought to ask that question at all. He was born on March 30th, 1970, at Meadow Stable in Virginia, to an owner who had not chosen him at all. Meadow Stable had been built by Christopher Chenery into one of the more respected operations in American racing, and by 1969, it was Chenery's daughter, Penny Chenery, who was making the stable's decisions as her father's health declined. Meadow Stable had a long-standing foal-sharing arrangement with Ogden Phipps and his own stable, a common practice among owners of that era who bred to each other's stallions and split the resulting foals to spread the risk of any single breeding going wrong. 2 mares would be bred that year, 2 foals would eventually result, and a coin toss between the 2 owners would decide who got first pick of the pair once both were born. In 1969, that coin came up for Phipps. He took first choice, a colt out of a different mare entirely. A horse that never amounted to anything close to what the mare he passed over would eventually produce. It was an ordinary decision, made under ordinary circumstances. 2 established stables had made this kind of arrangement together many times before. Nobody expected the outcome to matter beyond that year's foal crop. What Meadow Stable was left with, the animal nobody had wanted first, was a bay colt by the stallion Bold Ruler out of a mare named Something Royal. The colt was named Secretariat. There is an irony worth sitting with here, one the sport would return to again and again over the following decades. The horse that became the standard against which every other champion is measured was, at the moment of his birth, the consolation prize in a coin flip. Phipps had first pick of 2 unborn foals and did not pick him. Chenery got what was left of the arrangement and got, instead, the horse who would define the decade. Secretariat was trained by Lucien Laurent, a French-Canadian horseman who had built his own career the slow way, through decades in the barns before he ever had a horse capable of running for a Triple Crown. He was ridden by a jockey named Ron Turcotte, a man whose own story would later run parallel to the horse he rode, and then diverge from it sharply. A man who would end his own riding career paralyzed from the waist down in a separate accident years later. That is a different story. This one belongs to the horse. By 1973, American racing had gone 25 years without a Triple Crown winner. Citation had done it in 1948, the year the sport still assumed such a thing would happen every few seasons, the way it had happened repeatedly through the 1930s and 1940s. Then, it simply stopped happening. Horse after horse won 2 of the 3 races and came up short at the 3rd. Some faded in the stretch. Some lost by a nose. Some never got the chance, injured or retired before the Belmont ever arrived. A quarter century is a long enough drought that it stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like a verdict. The consensus among the people who covered the sport for a living had calcified into something close to certainty. The modern Triple Crown, 3 grueling races in 5 weeks against the best 3-year-olds in the country, was simply too much to ask of a single animal anymore. The distances, the recovery time, the level of competition, all of it had outgrown what any horse could reasonably survive intact. An entire generation of racing riders had built careers explaining, patiently, why the record from 1948 was likely to stand for good. Secretariat did not look, on paper, like the horse who would prove that consensus wrong. He was big, heavy through the body, built more like a horse bred for the middle distances of the Preakness than for the mile-and-a-half grind of the Belmont Stakes. Trainers of that era read a body like his and saw a sprinter, not a stayer. Bulk was not supposed to hold up over the final quarter mile of America's longest classic race. Horsemen had watched heavy-bodied colts fade in exactly that stretch, year after year. They had no particular reason to expect this one to be different. Then there was the Preakness itself, run 2 weeks after the Derby in May of 1973. A race that should have settled the question and instead unsettled it for decades. The official time clocks Secretariat only second fastest in Preakness history. But the reporters and clockers stationed independently along the rail, stopwatches running on their own, timed him faster, possibly a new stakes record outright. The discrepancy between the official time and the independent watches became a genuine, sustained controversy. Racing writers argued over it for years. Track stewards did not officially correct the record until 2012, 39 years after the race had already been run. In the moment, in 1973, the confusion read to skeptics as one more reason to withhold judgment rather than one more piece of evidence. The horse had not yet done anything the record books were prepared to certify as historic. So the doubt held, right up until the moment it didn't. The Kentucky Derby ran on May 5, 1973. Secretariat won it in 1 minute 59 2/5 seconds. The first time any horse had run the Derby in under 2 minutes. It remains the record today, more than half a century later. What made the time more remarkable than the number alone was the shape of it. Conventional wisdom held that a horse should run its fastest early and fade through the final quarter, conserving what it could. Secretariat ran the opposite race. Each quarter-mile split was faster than the one before it, a horse accelerating through the stretch of America's most famous race instead of hanging on. Trainers who had spent careers reading fractions had never seen a Derby run backward like that. The Preakness followed 2 weeks later at Pimlico, and whatever the broken clock said or didn't say, nobody watching from the stands needed a stopwatch to see what had happened. Secretariat took the lead early and never gave it back. Exactly the pattern that had unsettled trainers before the Derby and would go on unsettling them for one more race. 2 legs of the Triple Crown were now behind him, and the drought that had held for 25 years had one obstacle left standing between it and history. Then came a third piece of evidence, and it had nothing to do with a racetrack at all. Before the Belmont Stakes had even been run, before the Triple Crown was secured, a syndication deal valued Secretariat's breeding rights at $6.08 million, a record sum for the time. Owners do not commit that kind of money on sentiment, and Penny Chenery's decision to sell now, before the third leg, was itself a signal read carefully by everyone in the sport. The market did not wait for the Belmont to confirm what the first 2 races had already made clear. $6 million is not a sentimental number. It is an actuarial one, arrived at by men whose entire business was assessing horseflesh for a living. And it said, before a single hoof touched the Belmont track, that they had already made their determination. The Belmont Stakes ran on June 9, 1973, in front of 69,138 people, the largest crowd the track had drawn in years. They came because everyone understood what was potentially about to happen. A 25-year wait was either about to end that afternoon or extend itself for another season, and the size of the crowd was itself a kind of evidence. People do not travel in those numbers to watch a formality. They travel because something in the air suggests history is genuinely available to be witnessed, not just hoped for. Only 5 horses went to the gate that day, a small field for a race of this magnitude, a sign in itself of how thoroughly the rest of the division had already conceded the point. Sham, Secretariat's closest rival from the Derby and the Preakness, was there again. The one-horse connections still believed could make a real race of it. Track announcer Cheek Anderson had the call, and partway through the race, watching a horse pull steadily away from a field that could not stay within shouting distance of him, Anderson said the words that would outlive the broadcast itself. "He is moving like a tremendous machine." It was commentary in the moment, description improvised under pressure with no way of knowing what it would later mean. Nobody calling a race live is trying to write a medical diagnosis. Anderson was reaching for a phrase to describe what he was watching, some way to make a widening gap between one horse and the rest of the field sound as strange as it looked. The language he reached for turned out to be, in a way no one alive that day could have understood, literally, biologically accurate. The fractions tell their own story, each one faster than trainers of that era believed a horse should run this deep into a 1.5-mile race. 23 3/5 seconds for the first quarter, 46 1/5 at the half, 1 minute 9 4/5 seconds through 6 furlongs, 1 minute 34 1/5 at the mile. Every one of those splits ranks among the fastest ever recorded at that distance in that race. Sham, no slouch himself, a horse who would have won a Triple Crown in almost any other year, simply could not stay with him. Secretariat did not simply win, he won by 31 lengths, the largest margin of victory in the history of the Belmont Stakes, in a final time of 2 minutes and 24 seconds flat, over 1.5 miles. A time that stands today, more than half a century and countless champions later, as the American record on dirt at that distance. Nobody has come within a length of the clock, let alone within shouting distance of the margin. He had become, that afternoon, the 9th horse in history to win the Triple Crown, and the first in 25 years. The drought was over. It had ended by 31 lengths, which is not how anyone expected a 25-year drought to end. A generation of writers who had built careers explaining why it could not be done watched it happen by a margin that made the question look, in retrospect, almost naive. Secretariat raced only a handful more times before his retirement later that year, and moved to stud at Claiborne Farm in 1974, a career that, in horse racing, is frequently worth more than the one on the track, since a champion's genes are, in theory, the whole point of everything that came before. What followed was, by the standards of what had come before, a quiet disappointment. As a sire of pure racing speed, direct offspring who could reproduce what he had done on the track, Secretariat's record was unremarkable. The fastest horse many people alive had ever seen did not, it turned out, reliably pass that speed to his sons and daughters in any simple, direct way a breeder of the 1970s knew how to read. For years, that was treated as the quiet coda to an otherwise perfect story. Breeders paid enormous sums for his foals in the early years, expecting the track performance to repeat itself in the next generation, the way it usually did with a champion this decorated. It mostly didn't. The greatest racehorse anyone alive had seen simply did not reproduce, at least not in the direct, straightforward way the industry expected greatness to reproduce. And by the early 1980s, that verdict had settled into something close to conventional wisdom among breeders who had bet on him and come up short. Yet the verdict was incomplete. It measured only what a stallion is normally measured for, his sons, his direct male line runners, and it was looking in only one place. Through his daughters, the picture changed entirely, and it changed slowly enough that almost nobody noticed it happening in real time. Secretariat's influence entered the maternal lines of American thoroughbred breeding and stayed there, surfacing generations later in horses like A.P. Indy, whose pedigree traces back through a Secretariat mare. The horse who could not reliably sire speed himself had, apparently, passed something else along, something that skipped a generation, that traveled through daughters rather than sons, in a pattern that nobody breeding horses in 1974 had the framework to read correctly. It would take another discovery, on another table, 15 years later, to suggest what that something might actually have been. He died on October 4, 1989, of laminitis, a painful hoof condition, at the age of 19, at Claiborne Farm, the same ground where his career as a stallion had quietly disappointed and quietly, invisibly, succeeded at the same time. It was there, in the routine autopsy that followed, that Dr. Thomas Swerchek found the heart. Here is what needs to be said plainly, because the story is often told without it. Swerchek did not weigh Secretariat's heart on a scale, and no photograph of the organ exists. What survives is his professional estimate, based on examination, that the heart was in the range of 21 to 22 pounds, nearly 3 times the size of an average thoroughbred heart, which runs closer to 8 or 9 pounds. That gap matters, and naming it does not weaken the story. Even legends, even the ones with the most extraordinary physical evidence behind them, have edges that blur when examined closely. It was examined by a man who knew what he was looking at, who said what he saw, and whose account has never been seriously disputed by anyone who has since studied the case. What that heart later fed was a theory, sometimes called the X factor, that certain thoroughbreds inherit an enlarged heart trait through an X chromosome-linked gene, passed down the maternal line rather than the paternal one. It would explain, cleanly, the disappointment nobody in 1974 could account for. Secretariat's sons received only his Y chromosome and could not reliably reproduce what he had done. His daughters received his X chromosome and could carry the trait forward invisibly, generation after generation, exactly the pattern later observed surfacing in his broodmare descendants, including the horses that trace back to him through A.P. Indy's line. The disappointment at stud and the surprise generations later were, on this reading, the same fact, arriving on 2 different timelines. And it reaches back, finally, to Chick Anderson, calling a race in 1973 with no way of knowing what he was actually describing. He is moving like a tremendous machine. 16 years later, on a steel table, that phrase turned out to be closer to a diagnosis than anyone alive that day could have understood. A pathologist stands over a steel table in Kentucky, 1989. A heart in his hands that is nearly 3 times the size it should be. 16 years earlier, 69,138 people stood in the stands at Belmont Park and watched that same heart carry a horse 31 lengths clear of the field, and an announcer, without knowing why he was right, called him a tremendous machine. A coin toss once decided that Meadow Stable would get him at all, the animal nobody had picked first. Was Secretariat's greatness bred into every horse that followed him, or did it die with him on that steel table in 1989? Share your thoughts below. Thanks for watching.